Sarah Jenkins smoothed her cotton dress over her rounded belly, pausing to catch her breath in the thick Georgia heat. At 63, she carried herself with the kind of dignity that came from decades of standing tall through life's storms. The morning sun painted golden streaks across the weathered buildings of Millbrook, their familiar facades telling stories of generations who'd walked these streets before her. "Good morning, Mrs. Jenkins," called Marcus, the teenage boy who helped at Thompson's grocery. He was sweeping the sidewalk, his Cardinals baseball cap turned backwards as always. "How's the little one doing today?" Sarah's face lit up with the kind of smile that made others want to smile too. "Active as ever, honey. Keeps reminding me he's in there." She placed a gentle hand on her stomach, still marveling at the miracle that had blessed her and Thomas so late in life. The doctors had called it unprecedented, but Sarah called it divine intervention. The morning air carried the sweet scent of magnolias from Mrs. Henderson's garden, mixing with the aroma of fresh bread from Wilson's bakery. Sarah had planned everything perfectly for tonight's dinner. Thomas's favorite pot roast, those butter rolls he couldn't resist, and the peach cobbler recipe passed down from her grandmother. After 30 years of marriage, she still loved surprising him with special meals. As she walked, her mind drifted to the nursery they'd finished painting last weekend. Soft yellow walls with hand-painted clouds that Thomas had insisted on doing himself, though it had taken him 3 attempts to get them just right. The rocking chair by the window, the same one her mother had used, now restored and waiting for quiet moments with their child. "Lord, you sure do have a sense of humor," she whispered, both to God and to the baby. "Blessing us with you when most folks our age are spoiling grandchildren." Her comfortable shoes made a gentle rhythm on the sidewalk as she headed toward the farmer's market, her shopping list tucked safely in her purse alongside the novel she was reading for her book club. The screech of tires against asphalt shattered the morning's peace. Sarah's heart jumped as a police cruiser pulled alongside her, its sudden presence casting a shadow over her path. The driver's door swung open with unnecessary force, and Officer Richard Blake emerged, his face set in hard lines that had nothing to do with the morning sun. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some identification." His voice carried none of the courtesy the word ma'am implied. Sarah felt her chest tighten, recognizing Officer Blake from conversations at church, where more than one person had shared stories about his particular brand of maintaining order in certain neighborhoods. "Officer Blake, I'm just heading to the market." Sarah kept her voice steady, reaching slowly for her purse. Years of experience had taught her the choreography of these moments. Movements deliberately slow, voice carefully modulated, dignity wrapped around her like armor. "There's been reports of suspicious activity in this area." His hand rested on his belt, too close to his weapon for comfort. "You match a description we received." Sarah noticed Mrs. Henderson watching from behind her curtains, phone in hand. 2 young men across the street had stopped their conversation, their bodies tense with recognition of what was unfolding. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 30 years, Officer Blake. I'm Sarah Jenkins, Thomas Jenkins' wife. We attend First Baptist on Maple. I didn't ask for your life story." Blake cut her off, stepping closer. The morning sun caught his badge, sending a sharp glare into Sarah's eyes. "What's in the purse?" Sarah's fingers trembled slightly as she opened her purse, careful to move slowly. "My wallet, my book for book club, and my shopping list, officer. Would you like to—" The world tilted suddenly, violently. Later, witnesses would describe how Officer Blake's boot connected with Sarah's hip, sending her off balance. They would recall the horrible moment of suspension before she fell, her hands instinctively moving to protect her stomach rather than break her fall. The sound of her body meeting the concrete would echo in their nightmares. Sarah's world narrowed to the rough texture of the sidewalk against her cheek, the sharp pain radiating through her hip, and the desperate prayer forming on her lips. "Please, Lord, protect my baby." Voices erupted around her, shouts of anger, cries of alarm, the click and whir of phone cameras capturing what had happened. But above it all, Sarah heard Mrs. Henderson's voice, strong and clear. "I've got it all on video, Sarah. Don't you worry, honey. Help is coming." Through the haze of pain and fear, Sarah thought of Thomas. Thomas, who kept their home filled with laughter. Thomas, who read poetry to her belly every night. Thomas, who carried secrets behind his gentle smile that even she, after 3 decades of marriage, was only beginning to understand. As sirens wailed in the distance and gentle hands helped her remain still, Sarah closed her eyes and whispered another prayer. This one not for herself or her baby, but for Officer Blake. Because something told her that by tomorrow, he would need all the prayers he could get. The morning sun continued its arc across the Georgia sky, indifferent to how the world below had just shifted on its axis. And somewhere across town, Thomas Jenkins' phone was about to ring, setting in motion events that would remind Millbrook that justice sometimes arrives in unexpected ways, wearing the face of a quiet man who loves his family more than life itself. Thomas Jenkins sat in his climate-controlled office at Jenkins Security Solutions, reviewing quarterly projections when his personal phone vibrated against the polished mahogany desk. The moment he saw Gloria Henderson's name flash across the screen, a familiar weight settled in his chest. The same weight he'd carried through countless missions in places whose names never appeared in official reports. Gloria. His voice remained steady, though his fingers had already begun closing programs on his computer, muscle memory from years of rapid deployment taking over. Thomas, it's Sarah. Gloria's voice cracked. That monster Blake, he kicked her. Thomas. She's hurt. They're taking her to Memorial Hospital. I got it all on video, every second of it. I swear to God, Thomas, The line went quiet as Thomas processed her words, each one landing like a physical blow. The part of him that had spent 25 years in military intelligence was already calculating, analyzing, planning. But the husband in him, the man who'd kissed Sarah goodbye just hours ago while she talked about tonight's pot roast, that man was screaming, "I'm on my way." He ended the call, his movements precise as he gathered his things. Passing his secretary's desk, he spoke without breaking stride. "Carol, clear my schedule. Family emergency." The drive to Memorial Hospital took exactly 12 minutes and 43 seconds. Thomas counted each one, his hands perfectly positioned at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, his speed exactly at the limit. He learned long ago that moments of crisis require precision, not panic. Yet beneath that carefully maintained exterior, memories flickered like an old film reel. Sarah, radiant in her wedding dress 29 years ago, promising to love him despite the parts of himself he could never fully explain. Sarah, holding his hand through his mother's funeral, her strength flowing into him like a river. Sarah, 6 months ago, tears of joy streaming down her face as she showed him the positive pregnancy test, defying every medical probability. The hospital parking lot was already filling with familiar faces from the neighborhood. News traveled fast in Millbrook, especially news like this. Thomas recognized Rever in Mitchell's car, and beside it, Marcus Thompson's mother's minivan. The community was rallying, just as they had when the Hendersons' house caught fire last summer, just as they did when never one of their own was hurting. Inside, the emergency department hummed with controlled chaos. Thomas approached the desk, his bearing causing the young nurse to straighten instinctively. "Sarah Jenkins." "My wife." "Mr. Jenkins." Dr. Patricia Chun emerged from behind a curtain, her face professionally neutral, but her eyes kind. Thomas had helped with her cybersecurity system last year when her clinic had faced ransomware threats. "Come with me, please." They walked down the corridor, Dr. Chen's words flowing in a steady stream of medical terminology that Thomas's trained mind automatically cataloged and analyzed. Impact trauma to the left hip, fetal monitoring shows stable heartbeat, preventative measures, observation period. Through the partially drawn curtain, Thomas saw Sarah lying on the hospital bed, Gloria Henderson holding her hand. His wife's face was turned toward the window, but he could see the tear tracks on her cheeks. A monitor beside the bed tracked their baby's heartbeat, strong and steady. Thank God. "Thomas." Sarah's voice trembled as she reached for him. In 3 long strides, he was beside her, carefully gathering her hands in his. Her skin felt cool to the touch, and he could see the angry scrape on her cheek where it had met the concrete. "I'm here, love." He pressed his lips to her knuckles, noting the small abrasions there too. "I'm right here." "The baby," she started, but Thomas cut her off gently. "Is doing just fine. Dr. Chin says you both need rest and observation, but you're both strong." He managed to smile. Stubborn too, just like your mama. Outside the curtain, voices grew louder as more people arrived. Thomas could hear phones chiming with notifications. No doubt the video Gloria had taken was already spreading across social media. He needed to get a copy, analyze it frame by frame. The intelligence officer in him was already building a dossier in his mind, but he pushed those thoughts aside. Right now, Sarah needed her husband, not the man he'd been before they met. Gloria squeezed Sarah's other hand. I should step out, let you two have some time. But Thomas? Her voice hardened. That video's already got 10,000 shares. Channel 4 called me for an interview, and Reverend Mitchell is organizing a prayer vigil tonight. This isn't going away. Thomas nodded, his thumb tracing circles on Sarah's palm. Thank you, Gloria, for everything. Once they were alone, Sarah's composure cracked. I was so scared, Thomas. Not for me, but the baby. I couldn't break my fall because I had to protect. A sob caught in her throat. Chill. Thomas leaned forward, pressing his forehead to hers. You did exactly right. You protected our child. Now let me protect you both. Sarah's eyes met his, and for a moment, he saw a flash of understanding there. In 29 years of marriage, she'd never pushed him to talk about his time and intelligence, never pressed when he had to travel suddenly for his consulting work. She'd simply loved him, trusted him, built a life with him that felt like redemption for all the dark things he'd had to do in service to his country. Thomas, she whispered, whatever you're thinking, be careful. He kissed her forehead softly. Always am, love. A nurse entered with forms to sign, and Thomas shifted seamlessly into the role of concerned husband handling paperwork. But part of his mind was already reaching out across the vast network he'd maintained since leaving active service. He thought about the encrypted phone in his home office, the one Sarah pretended not to know about the favors he was owed by people whose very existence was classified. Officer Richard Blake had kicked a pregnant grandmother to the ground in broad daylight, thinking he was untouchable. Thomas allowed himself a moment to appreciate the irony. He'd spent decades protecting America from external threats, only to find the real danger wearing a badge in his own hometown. Through the window, he could see the crowd growing outside the hospital. Signs were already appearing. Justice for Sarah, Black Lives Matter, protect our mothers. The media vans were arriving too, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal flowers seeking light. Sarah had drifted into an uneasy sleep, her hand still clasped in his. Thomas watched the rise and fall of her chest, listened to the steady beeping of the fetal monitor. In his pocket, his phone buzzed continuously as word spread and old colleagues reached out. They knew, as few others did, what Thomas Jenkins was capable of when someone threatened his family. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the hospital room floor as Thomas began to plan. Officer Blake had no idea that his act of casual cruelty had just set in motion something far beyond his comprehension. By targeting Sarah Jenkins, he hadn't just assaulted an innocent woman. He'd awakened a man who'd spent his life learning how to dismantle threats without leaving fingerprints. Thomas watched a news van pull into the parking lot, its logo bright against the white paint. Inside his head, gears that hadn't turned in years began to move. Sarah would get justice, but not through protests alone. No, this would require a more precise approach. As if sensing his thoughts, Sarah stirred slightly in her sleep, her face tightening with pain. Thomas gentled his expression immediately, squeezing her hand. Rest easy, love, he murmured. Everything's going to be all right. And it would be, just not for Officer Richard Blake. Outside the hospital room, the community's anger was building like a thunderstorm. But inside, Thomas Jenkins sat perfectly still, already seeing the dominoes he would need to tip, one by one, until a certain police officer's world collapsed with the inevitability of gravity. The monitoring machines beeped their steady rhythm as afternoon deepened toward evening. Thomas's phone buzzed again, a message from a number he hadn't seen in years. He allowed himself a small smile as he read it. Say the word. The word would indeed be said, but not yet. First, Thomas needed to ensure Sarah and the baby were stable. Then he needed to gather intelligence, analyze patterns, identify pressure points. After that, well, After that, Officer Blake would learn that some men retire from service but never forget their training. Through the hospital window, Thomas could see the first news crews setting up their equipment, their cameras aimed at the hospital entrance. Soon they would tell Sarah's story to the world, sparking outrage and calls for justice. But they wouldn't tell the whole story. They couldn't know about the quiet war about to be waged in the shadows of their headlines. Thomas settled deeper into his chair, his posture relaxed, but his mind racing. In the bed beside him, Sarah slept on, unaware that her gentle husband was already assembling an invisible army. The afternoon light painted patterns on the hospital floor, and somewhere in Millbrook, Officer Richard Blake was about to discover that actions have consequences. Some obvious, some subtle, and some absolutely terminal to a career built on abuse of power. The game was about to begin, and Thomas Jenkins had never lost a game he couldn't afford to lose. As evening settled over Millbrook, Officer Richard Blake sat in his patrol car, parked behind the station, his fourth cigarette of the hour burning between trembling fingers. The video had gone viral faster than a summer wildfire, and his phone hadn't stopped buzzing with notifications. Even his mother had called, her voice tight with disappointment. "Richard James Blake, what have you done?" What had he done? The question echoed in his mind as he watched the smoke curl up toward the car ceiling. He'd done what he always did. Maintained order, showed strength, made sure people respected the badge. Except this time, something felt different. Maybe it was the woman's age, or her obvious pregnancy, or the way the whole thing had been captured in high definition from multiple angles. Whatever it was, Blake could feel control slipping through his fingers like sand. Inside the station, Captain Morris was waiting to speak with him. Blake knew what was coming. Administrative leave pending investigation, surrender of badge and weapon, the whole routine. He'd seen it happen to others, but they'd always bounce back. A few weeks of paid vacation, some sensitivity training, and back on the streets. The system protected its own. But as Blake crushed his cigarette into the overflowing ashtray, his phone buzzed with a different kind of notification. His banking app was warning him of unusual activity. Frowning, he opened it to find his accounts frozen, all of them. A technical error, surely. He tried calling the bank's emergency number, but after 15 minutes on hold, he was disconnected. That was just the beginning. Across town, in a home office filled with cutting-edge technology, Thomas Jenkins sat before 3 monitors, his fingers dancing across keyboards as he orchestrated the first phase of what he privately termed Operation Consequence. On one screen, he watched Blake's digital life begin to unravel. On another, he reviewed footage from Blake's previous incidents, footage that had mysteriously disappeared from official records but was now being recovered from encrypted backups. The third screen showed a real-time feed of Blake's patrol car, courtesy of a tiny drone deployed by one of Thomas's former colleagues who happened to be passing through town. Running facial recognition on historical footage now, came a voice through his secure earpiece. Maria, one of the best data miners in the business, was already compiling a comprehensive dossier on Blake's career. "You're not going to believe what I'm finding, Tom. This guy's been a walking violation of civil rights for years." "Send everything through the usual channels," Thomas replied, his voice soft but firm. "And Maria? Make sure it's ironclad. I want nothing that can't be verified independently." "Already on it. By the way, your wife's hospital records are triple encrypted now. Nobody's getting anywhere near those files without setting off every alarm in the system." Thomas allowed himself a small smile. His network was performing beautifully, each person playing their part in a symphony of calculated retribution. But this was just the overture. Back at Memorial Hospital, Sarah was finally resting comfortably, the pain medication taking the edge off her injuries. Gloria had gone home to rest, but not before ensuring that her video was safely backed up in multiple secure locations. The hospital hallways buzzed with activity as nurses changed shifts and visitors came and went, many stopping to leave flowers or cards for Mrs. Jenkins, the lady from the video. Thomas's phone chirped with an encrypted message. Package 1 delivered. Right on schedule. He knew that at that exact moment, Officer Blake was discovering that his home internet had mysteriously failed. When he called his service provider, he'd find his account had been flagged for non-payment, despite his automatic payments being set up correctly for years. Small inconveniences, really, hardly worth reporting. But they were just the first raindrops before the storm. As night settled over Millbrook, Thomas initiated the next phase. A series of precisely timed data releases began hitting local news stations. First, body cam footage from Blake's previous incidents. Footage that had been lost in system crashes but was now mysteriously recovered. Then, civilian complaints that had been buried in administrative limbo. Financial records showing unusual patterns in B. Curl up toward the car's ceiling. He'd done what he always did. Maintained order, showed strength, made sure people respected the badge. Except this time, something felt different. Maybe it was the woman's age, or her obvious pregnancy, or the way the whole thing had been captured in high definition from multiple angles. Whatever it was, Blake could feel control slipping through his fingers like sand. Inside the station, Captain Morris was waiting to speak with him. Blake knew what was coming. Administrative leave pending investigation, surrender of badge and weapon, the whole routine. He'd seen it happen to others, but they'd always bounce back. A few weeks of paid vacation, some sensitivity training, and back on the streets. The system protected its own. But as Blake crushed his cigarette into the overflowing ashtray, his phone buzzed with a different kind of notification. His banking app was warning him of unusual activity. Frowning, he opened it to find his accounts frozen, all of them. A technical error, surely. He tried calling the bank's emergency number, but after 15 minutes on hold, he was disconnected. That was just the beginning. Across town, in a home office filled with cutting-edge technology, Thomas Jenkins sat before 3 monitors, his fingers dancing across keyboards as he orchestrated the first phase of what he privately termed Operation Consequence. On one screen, he watched Blake's digital life begin to unravel. On another, he reviewed footage from Blake's previous incidents, footage that had mysteriously disappeared from official records but was now being recovered from encrypted backups. The third screen showed a real-time feed of Blake's patrol car, courtesy of a tiny drone deployed by one of Thomas's former colleagues who happened to be passing through town. Running facial recognition on historical footage now, came a voice through his secure earpiece. Maria, one of the best data miners in the business, was already compiling a comprehensive dossier on Blake's career. "You're not going to believe what I'm finding, Tom. This guy's been a walking violation of civil rights for years." "Send everything through the usual channels," Thomas replied, his voice soft but firm. "And Maria? Make sure it's ironclad. I want nothing that can't be verified independently." "Already on it. By the way, your wife's hospital records are triple encrypted now. Nobody's getting anywhere near those files without setting off every alarm in the system." Thomas allowed himself a small smile. His network was performing beautifully, each person playing their part in a symphony of calculated retribution. But this was just the overture. Back at Memorial Hospital, Sarah was finally resting comfortably, the pain medication taking the edge off her injuries. Gloria had gone home to rest, but not before ensuring that her video was safely backed up in multiple secure locations. The hospital hallways buzzed with activity as nurses changed shifts and visitors came and went, many stopping to leave flowers or cards for Mrs. Jenkins, the lady from the video. Thomas's phone chirped with an encrypted message. Package 1 delivered. Right on schedule. He knew that at that exact moment, Officer Blake was discovering that his home internet had mysteriously failed. When he called his service provider, he'd find his account had been flagged for non-payment, despite his automatic payments being set up correctly for years. Small inconveniences, really, hardly worth reporting. But they were just the first raindrops before the storm. As night settled over Millbrook, Thomas initiated the next phase. A series of precisely timed data releases began hitting local news stations. First, body cam footage from Blake's previous incidents, footage that had been lost in system crashes but was now mysteriously recovered. Then, civilian complaints that had been buried in administrative limbo. Financial records showing unusual patterns in B. Lake spending. Nothing overtly damaging, but enough to raise questions. At the police station, Captain Morris was dealing with his own headaches. Anonymous tips were flooding the department's internal affairs division. Each one was meticulously documented, backed by evidence that seemed to materialize out of thin air. Morris had seen witch hunts before, but this was different. This was surgical. Thomas leaned back in his chair, reviewing the progress. Phase 1 was proceeding perfectly, death by 1,000 digital cuts. Blake's world wasn't collapsing. It was being dismantled with precision, one piece at a time. Every time he turned around, another small but crucial part of his life would be just slightly wrong. His credit cards would be declined for suspicious activity. His gym membership would show as expired. His favorite coffee shop would have no record of his loyalty points. "Sir," came another voice through the earpiece. This one belonging to Jake, a former NSA analyst who owed Thomas his life twice over. "We got movement. Blake just left the station. He's heading home, but he's taking a circuitous route. Want us to maintain surveillance. Keep eyes on him, but maintain distance," Thomas instructed. "Let him feel the pressure building. How's the media package coming? Ready for distribution at your command. Every major outlet in the state will receive it simultaneously. Are you sure you want to wait?" Thomas glanced at his watch. Timing was everything in operations like this. "Hold for now. Let's see how he handles the first wave." Through the drone's feed, Thomas watched Blake's patrol car weave through Millbrook streets. The officer's driving was erratic. Not enough to justify a stop, but enough to show his agitation. "Good. Let him sweat." Thomas's phone buzzed again, this time with a text from Sarah. Despite his insistence that she rest, she was still awake. "The baby's kicking up a storm. Wish you were here to feel it." For a moment, Thomas's carefully constructed veneer cracked. The image of Sarah lying on that sidewalk flashed through his mind, and his fingers tightened on the desk's edge. But no, emotion couldn't drive this operation. Cold, calculated precision would bring Blake down, not hot-blooded revenge. He texted back, "Try to rest, love. I'll be there first thing in the morning." Then, switching back to his secure line, "Maria, activate the next sequence. Let's see how Officer Blake handles a little more pressure." Across town, Blake pulled into his driveway, only to find his garage door wouldn't respond to the remote. As he got out to check it, his neighbor's security lights clicked on, bathing him in sudden brightness. Just a coincidence, surely. But as he walked to his front door, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. Inside his house, Blake would soon discover that his smart home system had developed a mind of its own. Temperatures would fluctuate randomly. Lights would turn on and off at odd hours. His security cameras would show strange glitches, nothing alarming, just enough to keep him on edge. Thomas switched off his main monitors but left the surveillance feeds running. Tomorrow would bring new pressures, new revelations, new cracks in Blake's facade. But for now, it was time to let the first phase sink in. Let Blake begin to understand that his world was no longer entirely under his control. In the hospital room, Sarah shifted in her sleep, one hand resting protectively over her belly. Thomas watched her through the security feed he'd installed in her room, his heart aching with love and determination. Blake had thought he was untouchable, protected by his badge and the system that had always backed him up. But Blake didn't understand what he'd actually done. He hadn't just assaulted a pregnant woman. He'd attacked the wife of a man who'd spent decades learning how to dismantle threats from the shadows. A man who had built a network of professionals who owed him favors and shared his sense of justice. A man who could wage war without ever appearing on the battlefield. Thomas's phone buzzed one final time for the night. All systems in place. Awaiting your command for Phase 2. He typed back a single word, proceed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for justice. But tonight, somewhere in Millbrook, Officer Richard Blake was beginning to learn a fundamental truth. Some actions have consequences that no badge can deflect, no system can prevent, and no power can stop once they're set in motion. The night deepened, and Thomas allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Phase 1 had begun perfectly. Soon, very soon, Blake would understand that his true punishment wasn't coming from the protests or the media outrage. It was coming from the quiet man whose name he didn't even know, whose power he couldn't see, and whose determination he couldn't possibly comprehend. The next morning dawned with an unsettling quiet over Millbrook. Officer Richard Blake woke to find his alarm hadn't gone off, the third electronic malfunction in 12 hours. His coffee maker refused to work, his shower ran cold, and when he tried to check his email, His password had mysteriously changed. Small inconveniences piled up like snowflakes before an avalanche. As Blake stood in his kitchen, holding his dead phone and trying to remember if he'd paid his electricity bill, his doorbell camera chimed. The screen showed no one, but when he opened his front door, he found a manila envelope. No postmark, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper listing dates, times, and names. Every complaint ever filed against him, including ones he thought had been buried so deep they'd never see daylight. Across town, Thomas Jenkins sat in Sarah's hospital room, appearing every bit the concerned husband as he peeled an apple with careful precision. To the nurses who came and went, he was simply a devoted spouse, his attention focused entirely on his wife's recovery. They couldn't see the wireless earpiece nestled discreetly in his ear, or know that every slow turn of the apple was timed to the updates he was receiving. Target's heart rate elevated 15% above baseline. Maria's voice whispered in his ear. He spent the last hour trying to access his cloud storage. Should I let him in yet? Thomas set down a perfectly curved apple peel. Let him see the first folder. Nothing else. Sarah watched him with knowing eyes as he offered her a slice of apple. You've got that look, she murmured, quiet enough that the nursing student checking her vitals couldn't hear. What look is that, love? The one you used to get before you disappear for weeks on consulting work. She accepted the apple slice, her fingers brushing his. I never asked then. I'm not asking now. Just remember who you are. Thomas leaned forward, pressing a kiss to her forehead. I'm exactly who I've always been. A man who loves his wife and will protect his family. Outside the hospital, the morning news crews were setting up for their live broadcasts. The story had gone national overnight. Not just another case of police brutality, but one with elements that made it impossible to ignore. A pregnant grandmother, a wealthy black family, a respected businessman husband, and crystal-clear video evidence. The morning shows were already running with taglines like American Dream turned Nightmare and Justice for Sarah. But Thomas knew the real story was playing out in much quieter ways. Officer Blake sat in his car, staring at his computer screen. The folder he'd finally managed to access contained photos, hundreds of them. Him accepting an envelope in a parking lot. Him with his hand raised against a teenage suspect. Him at locations he'd never listed in his official reports. Each photo was dated, time-stamped, and accompanied by GPS coordinates. His phone rang, one of the few electronic devices still working correctly. The caller ID showed his brother's number. Rick, his brother's voice was strained. Why are the feds asking questions about your finances? Blake's blood ran cold. What? 2 agents just left my house. They were asking about that money I loaned you last year. Said something about a routine audit. Rick, what's going on? Before Blake could answer, his phone chimed with a text message from an unknown number. We know about Monaco. His fingers went numb. Nobody knew about Monaco. He'd used a fake name, paid cash, kept no receipts. It was impossible. In Sarah's hospital room, Thomas fed her another apple slice while listening to Blake's heart rate spike through the biometric sensors Maria had planted in his car. Phase 2 is progressing well, he said softly, knowing his team would hear. Initiate the bank sequences. Across 3 states, a series of carefully orchestrated financial algorithms began to run. They would find nothing illegal in Blake's accounts. That would be too obvious. Instead, they would uncover patterns, questions, discrepancies just large enough to warrant further investigation. Tom, Maria's voice had an edge of admiration. The pattern recognition software just flagged something interesting. Looks like our friend has been moonlighting as a security consultant. Want to guess who for? Thomas smiled, remembering his own years of building cover stories. Send it to Jake for analysis. Let's see who else might be interested in Officer Blake's extracurricular activities. Sarah dozed fitfully, the pain medication making her drowsy. Thomas used the quiet moment to review the overnight reports on his tablet. His network had been busy. Every piece of Blake's life had been examined, every connection mapped, every vulnerability identified. The hospital room door opened, admitting Dr. Chun with her morning rounds. Thomas smoothly switched his tablet to display hospital admission forms, the transition so natural that even a trained observer would have missed it. Blood pressure's looking better, Dr. Chen noted, reviewing Sarah's charts. And the baby's heart rate is strong and steady. Mr. Jenkins, has she been sleeping through the night? On and off, Thomas replied, playing his role perfectly. The pain wakes her sometimes. Dr. Chin made some notes in the chart. That's to be expected. We'll adjust her medication schedule. Also, just so you're aware, there are reporters trying to get into the maternity ward. We've increased security, but you might want to... I've taken care of it, Thomas said smoothly. Indeed, he had 3 former Secret Service agents were already positioned throughout the hospital, their presence invisible but effective. As Dr. Chen left, Thomas's earpiece crackled. Sir, Blake's making moves. He just called a lawyer, Joseph Martinez from Atlanta. Thomas allowed himself a small smile. Martinez was exactly who he'd expected Blake to call. The lawyer had a reputation for defending cops in trouble, with a suspiciously high success rate and connections to judges across 3 states. Let the call go through, Thomas instructed. But make sure Martinez's assistant receives those files we prepared. Within an hour, Martinez's office would discover certain irregularities in their case files. Nothing obviously tampered with, just enough discrepancies to make any ethical lawyer think twice about taking Blake's case. The digital breadcrumbs would lead to other cases, other clients, other questions that no one had thought to ask before. Sarah stirred, her hand seeking his. The baby's active today, she murmured. Like he knows something's happening. Thomas entwined his fingers with hers, marveling at how this woman had changed his life. Before her, his world had been shadows and secrets, missions and objectives. She'd brought light, shown him that love wasn't a weakness but the strongest force in the universe. Everything's fine, love, he assured her, even as his earpiece reported that Blake was now trying to access sealed records from his academy days. Everything's going exactly as it should. Outside, the mid-morning sun painted patterns on the hospital walls. Protesters had begun gathering again, their signs demanding justice, their voices rising in familiar chants. They didn't know that justice was already in motion, flowing not through the streets, but through fiber optic cables and secure servers, through whispered conversations and encrypted messages. Thomas's phone vibrated with a priority alert. Blake had just received another envelope, this one containing photographs from Monaco, along with account numbers and dates. In his car, parked behind the police station, the officer's heart rate had spiked again, triggering the biomedical sensors. He's making another call, Maria reported. This one's to a burner phone in Miami. Record everything, Thomas instructed. And Maria? Make sure our friends at the FBI get an anonymous tip about that number. It's time to add some federal pressure to the mix. The pieces were falling into place, each movement precisely calculated, each reaction predicted and planned for. Blake was being herded down a path he didn't even realize he was on, each step taking him closer to the inevitable conclusion. Sarah squeezed Thomas's hand, her eyes knowing. You always did like chess, she said softly. Thomas kissed her fingers, remembering the countless games they'd played over their years together. She'd never won, but she'd always understood the beauty of the game. The way each piece moved in concert, the sacrifice of pawns to protect the queen, the careful manipulation of the board until victory was inevitable. Just a few more moves, he whispered, as much to his team as to his wife. Just a few more moves. In his office, Blake was discovering that his computer access had been revoked, a routine security protocol, according to the system administrator. His paper files were missing, replaced by copies that were almost but not quite identical to the originals. Small details had changed, dates didn't quite match, signatures seemed slightly off. The walls were closing in, but so subtly that Blake couldn't point to any one thing that was clearly wrong. It was death by 1,000 digital cuts, each one too small to fight against, but collectively forming an unstoppable tide. Thomas checked his watch, counting down to the next phase. Soon, very soon, Blake would realize that his real enemy wasn't the protesters or the media or even the system itself. His real enemy was silence. The silence of data moving through networks, of favors being called in, of a lifetime of secrets being carefully unveiled. The baby kicked again, strong enough that Thomas could feel it through Sarah's hospital gown. New life, moving in concert with justice. There was poetry in that, he thought, even as his earpiece reported another spike in Blake's vitals. The game was entering its final stages, and Thomas Jenkins had every piece exactly where he wanted it. By late afternoon, Officer Richard Blake sat in his darkened office, surrounded by the digital ghosts of his past. His computer screen flickered with endless pop-ups, system alerts, security warnings, password reset notifications. Each click to dismiss one brought 3 more in its wake. The precinct's tech support team had thrown up their hands, claiming they'd never seen anything like it. But it wasn't just the technology that was haunting him. Every few minutes, his phone would buzz with another text from an unknown number. Each message contained a single detail from his past, things no one should know. The name of the waitress he'd roughed up in Atlanta before joining the force. The exact amount of money he'd accepted to lose certain evidence in 2019. The offshore account numbers he'd thought were untraceable. Your meeting in Monaco with Anthony Kovac. June 15th, 2022. Shall he discuss what was in the briefcase? Blake's hands trembled as he deleted the message. Kovac was a name he'd tried to forget, along with the contents of that briefcase and the promises he'd made in that sun-drenched hotel room. In Sarah's hospital room, Thomas Jenkins maintained his vigil, the picture of devoted husband. He'd brought fresh flowers, yellow roses, Sarah's favorite, and arranged them carefully by the window. To any observer, he was simply tending to his wife while processing the trauma of recent events. No one would guess that the gentle movements of his hands as he adjusted the flowers were timed to the updates flowing through his earpiece. Targets attempting to access his secondary email accounts, Maria reported. Should I let him see what we planted? Thomas straightened arose, his voice barely a whisper. Let him in. Start with Monaco. Sarah watched him from her bed, one hand resting protectively over her belly. The bruising on her face had deepened to purple, a visual reminder of why all of this was necessary. You haven't slept, she observed quietly. I'll sleep when you're home safe, he replied, his smile gentle, but his eyes holding that focused intensity she recognized from years ago. Down the hall, a nurse was arguing with yet another reporter trying to get access to Sarah's room. The media frenzy had only intensified as new details emerged about Blake's history of complaints. What none of them knew was that each leaked document, each anonymous source, was part of Thomas's orchestrated symphony of destruction. Blake's world was collapsing in layers, like a house of cards in slow motion. Each hour brought new revelations, new questions, new threads that, when pulled, unraveled another piece of his carefully constructed facade. Sir, Jake's voice came through Thomas's earpiece. Blake's lawyer just withdrew from the case. Seems he found some concerning irregularities in his client's history. Thomas nodded slightly, adjusting another rose. Martinez's withdrawal had been inevitable once certain documents had found their way to his paralegal's desk. The lawyer's own past indiscretions, carefully documented and anonymously delivered, had ensured his cooperation. How's his heart rate? Thomas asked softly, timing the question with a cough to mask his words. Elevated. The biometrics show increased stress patterns. Blood pressure's through the roof. He's made 3 calls to his doctor in the last hour. Physical symptoms of psychological pressure, right on schedule. Thomas had seen it before, during his intelligence days. The human mind could only handle so much uncertainty, so much fear, before the body began to break down. Sarah shifted in her bed, wincing slightly. Thomas was at her side instantly, helping her find a more comfortable position. As he adjusted her pillows, his earpiece crackled again. Tom, Maria's voice was urgent. He's trying to access his private server, the one in Switzerland. Let him through, Thomas instructed. Show him everything. Across town, Blake stared at his screen in horror as files he'd thought were secure began opening one by one. Photos, documents, recordings. Years of corruption laid bare in pixel-perfect detail. But it was the last file that made his blood run cold. A comprehensive dossier on Thomas Jenkins, including his extensive military intelligence background and his current connections to various 3-letter agencies. The pieces finally clicked into place. This wasn't just bad luck or karma. This was something else entirely. A precision strike orchestrated by someone who'd spent decades learning how to dismantle lives without leaving fingerprints. Blake's phone rang, the secure line he kept for emergencies. The number was blocked. "Hello, Officer Blake," said a voice he didn't recognize. "Mr. Kovacs sends his regards. He's very interested in the current situation. Perhaps it's time to consider your options." The line W and dead, leaving Blake alone with the realization that his world wasn't just falling apart. It was being systematically dismantled by forces he couldn't fight because he couldn't even see them. In the hospital room, Thomas read the spike in Blake's vitals on his tablet and knew the message had been delivered. Kovacs' involvement was a masterpiece of misdirection. The Croatian businessman would be very surprised to learn he'd been dragged into this. But by the time anyone figured out the truth, it wouldn't matter. "More flowers arrived for you," Thomas told Sarah, nodding toward the growing collection of bouquets from well-wishers. "The whole town's thinking of you." Sarah reached for his hand. "And what are you thinking of, my love?" Thomas met her eyes, seeing through the same strength that had first drawn him to her 3 decades ago. "I'm thinking that justice comes in many forms," he said softly. "Some loud, some quiet. Some in the light, some in the shadows." His phone buzzed, a message from an unlisted number. Package delivered to Channel 7. Broadcasting at 6 p.m. The endgame was approaching. In less than an hour, every major news outlet in the state would receive evidence of Blake's corruption so comprehensive, so irrefutable, that no amount of union protection or legal maneuvering could save him. But that was just the public face of justice. The real pressure, the silent, invisible kind that Thomas had perfected over decades, would continue until Blake did the only thing he could do: confess, resign, and disappear. Outside the hospital window, the sun was setting over Millbrook, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Thomas watched the colors change, remembering other sunsets in other places, other operations that had ended in quiet victories. Sarah's monitor beeped steadily, the baby's heartbeat strong and regular. Life continued, even as certain careers and reputations came to their carefully orchestrated ends. "Tom," Maria's voice came through one final time. "He's making the call." Thomas smiled, gentle and satisfied. In his office across town, Officer Richard Blake was reaching for his phone, preparing to call Captain Morris and do what people always did when the pressure became too much to bear: confess everything and beg for mercy. The game was over. Blake just didn't know it yet. Thomas leaned down to kiss Sarah's forehead, his lips gentle against her skin. "Rest now, love," he whispered. "Everything's going to be just fine." And it would be, for everyone except Officer Richard Blake, who was about to learn that some actions have consequences that no badge, no lawyer, and no amount of privilege could protect against. Sometimes justice wore a uniform and carried a badge. And sometimes it wore a gentle smile and carried decades of experience in making problems disappear. The sun set over Millbrook, and in its fading light, a man who had thought himself untouchable was about to discover just how wrong he had been. Captain Morris sat behind his desk, his face illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lights of his office, as Officer Richard Blake's world finally shattered completely. The confession had been flowing for 20 minutes now, each revelation more damaging than the last. Monaco, the bribes, the covered-up incidents, they spilled from Blake like poison from a lanced wound. Through his secure feed, Thomas Jenkins watched the scene unfold, his expression unchanging as Blake's career imploded in real time. Sarah had finally fallen into a deep sleep, her medication ensuring she wouldn't wake for hours. It gave Thomas the freedom to orchestrate this final act from the quiet corner of her hospital room. "Send the second package to the DA's office now," he whispered into his comm unit. "And make sure the FBI gets their copy simultaneously." Blake's voice cracked as he reached the part about Kovac. "I didn't have a choice," he insisted, his hands shaking as he gripped the arms of High's chair. "They had leverage, and I needed the money after my divorce." Captain Morris's face remained impassive, though the vein in his temple pulsed steadily. "Continue, Officer Blake. You mentioned something about evidence tampering in the Henderson case." As Blake opened his mouth to respond, every computer in the precinct suddenly came to life. Screens flickered, documents opened, and printers began spitting out page after page of damning evidence. Years of corruption documented in meticulous detail, each incident cross-referenced and verified. "Sir," a young officer burst into the office, clutching a stack of papers. "You need to see this. It's coming from every printer in the building." In his ear, Thomas heard Maria's satisfied whisper, "Broadcasting complete. Every precinct in the state just received the same data dump. Channel 7 is going live in 3 minutes." Thomas allowed himself a small smile as he watched Blake's face drain of color. The officer was realizing that this wasn't just a confession, it was an execution. His career, his reputation, his entire life was being systematically exposed and dismantled in front of his eyes. "There's more," Blake whispered, his voice hollow. "The Thompson case last year, and the incident at the mall, But Captain Morris was no longer listening. His attention had shifted to his computer screen, where emails were arriving rapid-fire from Internal Affairs, the State Police, and the FBI. Each one contained questions about Blake. Questions that were specific, detailed, and impossible to deflect. In the hospital room, Thomas's tablet silently displayed the cascade of events he'd set in motion. News stations across the state were interrupting their regular programming for breaking news about police corruption. Social media was exploding with fresh outrage as new details emerged. Blake's name was trending nationwide. "Mr. Jenkins?" Thomas looked up to find Dr. Chun in the doorway, her expression concerned. "Your wife's latest tests look good. The baby's heartbeat is strong, and the bruising is starting to fade. But there's something else you should know." She paused, glancing at her tablet. "We've been receiving calls from reporters asking about Officer Blake's previous victims. Apparently, several of them were treated here over the years. They're asking for statements." Thomas nodded solemnly. "I imagine a lot of people will be coming forward now," he said softly. "The truth has a way of encouraging courage." Back at the precinct, Blake had stopped talking. His eyes were fixed on the television mounted in the corner of Morris's office, where Channel 7 was showing footage he'd never seen before. Security camera videos, dashcam recordings, cell phone clips, a documentary of abuse spanning his entire career. "How," he whispered. "Those files were encrypted, protected, some of them destroyed." But Thomas knew the answer. In the digital age, nothing was ever truly destroyed. It just waited in the shadows of cyberspace, ready to be retrieved by those who knew where to look and how to look for it. "Tom," Maria's voice came through his earpiece. "Kovac's lawyers just issued a statement denying any connection to Blake. They're threatening legal action for defamation." Perfect. The phantom threat had served its purpose, adding another layer of pressure that had helped break Blake's resolve. Now it would disappear, leaving no trace of Thomas's involvement. Sarah stirred slightly in her sleep, and Thomas reached out to smooth her hair. The bruise on her cheek was fading from purple to yellow, but the memory of her lying on that sidewalk remained sharp in his mind. Some wounds healed slower than others. His phone buzzed with a message from Jake. "FBI moving in. 3 agents just entered the precinct." Thomas checked his watch. Right on schedule. The federal involvement would ensure that this didn't end with a quiet resignation and a pension. Blakwa. Old-faced charges, serious ones, backed by evidence so solid that no union lawyer would be able to challenge it. "Mr. Jenkins?" A nurse appeared at the door. "There's a call for you at the nurse's station. Someone from the district attorney's office." Thomas stood, his movements unhurried. "Please tell them I'll call back later. My wife needs me right now." The nurse nodded and left, never knowing she'd just been part of the final piece of Thomas's plan. The DA's office would wait, growing more anxious with each hour that passed. Their investigation building momentum without any direct involvement from the Jenkins family. In Captain Morris's office, Blake had stopped talking entirely. He sat slumped in his chair, watching his career and freedom disintegrate on multiple screens simultaneously. His phone lay silent. Every contact he tried to reach had suddenly become unavailable, their own self-interest outweighing any loyalty they might have felt. "Officer Blake," Morris said, his voice heavy with authority and disgust. "I'm placing you under suspension, pending a full investigation. Please surrender your badge and weapon." As Blake mechanically complied, Thomas received one final update in his ear. Target's vitals showing severe stress response. Blood pressure critical. Medical response may be needed. Monitor but don't intervene, Thomas instructed softly. Let the system handle it. He turned his attention back to Sarah, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest as she slept. The media would tell this story as one of corruption exposed, of justice served through the system. They would never know about the quiet war that had been waged through keyboards and servers, through whispered conversations and encrypted messages. Outside the hospital window, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the city, Richard Blake was discovering that power, like respect, was only real when other people believed in it. And sometimes, all it took to shatter that belief was the right pressure applied in exactly the right places. Thomas settled back into his chair, finally allowing himself to feel the weight of the past few days. The operation was nearly complete. By morning, Blake's resignation would be on Morris's desk, along with a full confession. The FBI would take custody of the evidence, ensuring that no local connections could bury it. And Sarah would heal, their baby would grow, and life would continue. But something in Millbrook had changed. A message had been sent, silent but clear. Some lines couldn't be crossed, some actions couldn't be excused, and some men couldn't be touched, not because they wore badges, but because they had spent lifetimes learning how to fight battles that most people never even knew were happening. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm as night settled over the city. In his office, Blake finally broke down completely, sobbing as he realized the full extent of his destruction. But Thomas wasn't watching anymore. His attention was solely on his wife, on their future, on the life they would continue to build together. Justice had been served, not with a bang, but with the quiet click of keyboards, the silent flow of data, and the careful manipulation of a system that thought it was untouchable. Tomorrow would bring press conferences and official statements, investigations and indictments. But tonight, in a quiet hospital room, Thomas Jenkins simply held his wife's hand and listened to the steady heartbeat of their unborn child. Proof that even in the darkest moments, life and love persisted. The game was over. The king had fallen. And in the end, it hadn't taken violence or vengeance, just the careful application of truth, delivered with surgical precision by a man who had spent his life learning how to wage war without ever stepping onto a battlefield.